volunteers are like gems in the landscape. As we start this presentation, I need to acknowledge one of the volunteers who is responsible for A, securing this room, B, setting it up, and she provided the pizza. Suzanne Rossini, where are you? Mark Meckler is an interesting gentleman. Has been since the day I met him, will probably be long after I die. He is an attorney, we won't hold that against him. He is also a visionary. Mark and other people started the Tea Party several years ago with the hopes of trying to make some impact on the government. Well, as we've learned over the course of time, it wasn't terribly effective. And so Mark started looking for some other alternatives. And after discussing the situation with academics, with authors, with other activists, he and another friend decided to start the Convention of States project. And you can see what's happening. We are seeing a great deal of success. Mark is recently transplanted from California, I believe it's the Sacramento area, down to Texas, and he's breathing a sigh of relief. And he has two youngsters and a beautiful wife. His wife works in the Convention of States with him. His two youngsters, one is a young lady that's going to Hillsdale College, and his son recently completed a 4-year tour in the Marine Corps and is now in law school. When we went to a summit meeting last August in Williamsburg, we concluded the meeting. We pretty well started to break up and walk out of the place. And Mark walked up to the podium. He said, "I want you guys to know something. I'm never gonna quit. Never, never, never." And I believe him. Mark Meckler.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you guys for coming tonight. It is, every time I get to do this, which is a lot, it's a rare privilege. I have a unique perspective on America, and probably different than most of you. Certainly different than the guys that we see on television every night when we watch the news. And my perspective on America comes through your eyes. I get to travel all over the country. This week, over the course of 10 days on this trip, I'll be in 8 states. And so that's not unusual for me to travel like that. And I don't travel in a Learjet and go into the airport and grab the limo and head to the hotel. You know, it's me, and I'm my entire entourage, and I carry my own bags. I am, by the way, just a little tidbit about me that people who know me know, I am notorious for overpacking. And so I carry a huge suitcase with me even when I'm going for a day or two. And for years it was a big blue hard-sided suitcase. Everybody wants to know, where's Big Blue when I'm traveling. I travel a lot. The reason I travel a lot is because I love the people of America. And when we watch people on television nowadays, and when you see the news, there's a general disdain for us, for the regular people of the country. And the truth is that disdain comes from both parties. Not everybody in both parties, but both parties. There is in Washington, D.C. today a ruling elite. They consider themselves elite anyway, and they certainly consider themselves the rulers. I would argue they're wrong on both counts. But there they are in Washington, D.C., and they're telling us what to do. And they believe they have the right to tell us what to do. Not only the right, but they believe that they have a moral obligation to tell us what to do. They actually think that they're better than us, smarter than us, wiser than us, richer. Well, most of them are richer than us. On our backs, I hate to say. You know, I've been going to Washington, D.C. now for about 10 years on and off since I started in the Tea Party movement. It's been really interesting because 10 years ago, back in 2009, you know, we're in the heart of the Depression, basically, the Great Recession. And in Washington, D.C., occasionally I'd fly into Dulles. If you've been into D.C., you know Dulles is the airport that's further out. And I would take a cab back then, Uber more recently, into the city. It's about a 40-minute ride or so, 35-minute ride. And as I rode along, I would count the construction cranes. The cranes that were missing from all the other cities I traveled to in the country, where I saw no building or abandoned building sites. All those giant construction cranes were in Washington, D.C. and the areas around Washington, D.C. 7 out of the 10 wealthiest counties in the United States of America are around Washington, D.C. It's incredible. The reason it's not all 10 is they have to have a place for the poor service employees to live. And we laugh about that, but it's not supposed to be this way. You know, this is not how the country was envisioned. I think they built Washington, D.C. in a swamp for a reason, is they didn't want them to stay there all the time. If we didn't have air conditioning, we might be better off in Washington, D.C. So I travel around the country, I get to meet folks like you all over the country, and it gives me an entirely different perspective. If you watch TV, and I try not to watch too much of it, you can get hopeless watching TV, right? And again, I'm going to place the blame all over the place, whether you're watching MSNBC, or Fox News, or CNN, or PBS, or whatever it is, all you see is terrible stuff. You see the tragedy, you see the suffering, you see bad people doing bad things to other people. That's not America, right? When I travel around America, what I see in every community I go to, I meet incredible patriots. People who love the country, people who understand what it was that built the country, people of faith, people of character, people who work in their communities. That's my view of America. I have a statue of Ronald Reagan in my office, a bust, and I don't have a lot of statuary. It was an award I got many years ago in the Tea Party movement, and I actually took the bust off of the award because I don't like the awards, and I just have Ronald Reagan's bust there in my office. And there's a quote on the back of it, and it's not the most common Reagan quote, but it's my favorite Reagan quote. And Reagan said that they say that we live in a time when there are no heroes, but they just don't know where to look. And that's my experience in America. You know, I travel around, I talk to a lot of people. Those of you who know me know that I'm always trying to find out what's your story. We were talking about your story tonight. I want to know everybody's story. And the reason I always want to know everybody's story is the truth is every person I meet in this country has an amazing story. There's a hero inside everybody. Something has happened in their life where they've done extraordinary things, overcome extraordinary obstacles, helped people in extraordinary ways, invented things, imagined things, dreamed things, done things. This is what the average American is like. It's like hard for me to say average American because I haven't met any of those. And so I have great hope for this country and great belief in the future of this country. That's my foundation. And where that comes from for me personally is from my faith. A little bit about me so you get to know me a little bit better. I was raised in Los Angeles, California. I have a very close family. We're all still really close. I have a brother who's 2 years younger than me. Both my parents are still alive. My dad's 81, my mom's 78. They moved to Texas with me recently. From a faith perspective, I was raised in a secular Jewish household. I'll tell you, for me growing up in LA, that's how most of the Jewish folks I knew were. We were all secular. Those who went to temple weren't really practicing. We were ritualizing, I would say. And I grew up really without faith. I went to college at San Diego State. At San Diego State, I learned that religion was the most evil force on earth in all of history. That's what I learned in college. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. That's what I was taught by my religion professors. I was really fascinated by religion because if you don't understand religion, you can't understand humanity. The course of humanity is directed by the course of religious movements throughout history. So I took a lot of religion courses. And when I came out of college, I was what I would describe as a very mean atheist. Like I really hated Christianity, Christians especially, learned that in college very specifically. And I thought that I had all the answers. I was the smartest guy in the room. I knew nothing, but I was the smartest guy in the room. And I had kids. I went through a bunch of stuff. And you know, when you have kids and you look at them in that crib and you see that miracle, it's hard to think that it's all about you anymore when you look at that, right? It's hard to, it's just a miracle. If you have kids, you know exactly what I'm saying. If you haven't had kids, trust me, you'll see it. If you're young and you haven't had them yet, you'll see it. And I remember looking at my son and thinking, that's just something more than I can understand, right? That's not just biology, that's a miracle. And if you believe in miracles, then there's something that's creating miracles, right? And so set me off on kind of a lifetime quest to figure out what was it all about, right? And I'm a slow learner. I promise you, I'm a very slow learner. I looked at everything in my life. I literally studied Buddhism pretty extensively. I studied Hinduism, the precursor to Hinduism, something most people never heard of called Jainism. I went to India, and I spent time in India. India is a fabulous, interesting place. The idea of religion in India that I fell in love with, not the religion, but the way religion is practiced in India is life is religion, and religion is life. There's no such thing as going to church on Sunday in India. Everybody has a little shrine in their home. There are temples all over the streets. I fell in love with that idea that it's not a separation between people and Sunday school. It's all the time. But I didn't find a home. I got into politics, and when I got into politics, I was a seeker, but still I would describe myself maybe agnostic at this point. And I met a bunch of people as I traveled around the country. I love people. It's just how I'm wired. I just love people. Everywhere I go, I find people I fall in love with. Always been this way my whole life. If you ask me what's my hobby and do you collect anything, I say collect relationships. That's what I love to collect, right? The more relationships I have, the richer I am. And so I always had that, and I started going into politics, and I travel around, and I would meet people, and I would sit with somebody, and I'd be having coffee late at night, and we'd be talking life and kids and politics and philosophy and religion, and I'd be thinking, man, I love this guy. He's just amazing. And I'd always get around asking, so what is it? Like, where do you get all that from? That love of life, that peace that you seem to have, whatever it is. And it was always, I heard this over and over, some version of, it's my faith, it's my relationship with Jesus, it's because I became a Christian. So I heard this all over. I'm a slow learner. I told you this, right? And so it didn't really do anything except for I kept saying, oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Today I say, thank you for being so patient, Lord, right? And so eventually, after doing all of this for so long, I met a guy who's become one of my closest friends. He sits on my board of directors. His name's Tim Dunn. And he started talking to me about, he asked me, what do you know about your own heritage and your own faith? And my answer was nothing, right? Really, nothing. I know both my folks are Jewish. We come from Ukraine. That's what I know about my faith. That's not a lot, I know. That's what I knew, but I knew everything, right? And he started introducing me to all this scripture, and he said, oh, you need to read Hebrews, and you need to study Paul, and you need to... Long story short, through all this, ultimately, I became a Christian. And I want to tell you, like, I wish when I tell this story, my testimony, I wish I could tell you, like, and I hiked to the top of this mountain, the clouds were... It didn't happen like that at all for me. This is how it happened for me. I don't remember the day. At some point I thought, it doesn't make any sense not to believe anymore. I guess I believe. Okay, yeah, that was it. That was pretty much it for me. It obviously changed everything in my life in one moment, and it explained a lot of the way that I'd always felt my entire life. Like I changed everything. Of course, I was reborn. Everything was new, and everything had changed, but it explained so much. And one of the things that explained to me, and I'm telling you this because there's going to be a theme here. I promise I'm going to get to it. I love people, right? And so Tim said to me one day, my good friend Tim, he said, do you know why you love people so much? And I said, I don't know. I'm a people person. I've always loved people. And he goes, no, that's not it. He said, who made people? And I said, well, God made people. And he goes, that's right. And in whose image did God make people? And I said, in his own image. And he said, so when you look in a person's eyes and you love that person, what are you loving? And I said, God? And he said, exactly. And he said, that's why you love people so much. Because when you build relationships with people and you get close with people, then you're getting closer to God. That's what God wants us to do. He wants us to be in relationships. So I'm telling you all that. I know that's not what you came to hear. I'm not here to preach a sermon. I'm telling you that because I just want you to know me a little better. It's really important that you know me because politicians don't want you to know them. There's a facade in front of a politician. There's a thing they want you to see, and that's what you're supposed to see. That's what you're supposed to vote for. I'm not a politician. I'm just a guy like you guys, like you men and women in this audience. So how does this tie all back to politics? Here's how it ties to politics for me. I did the Tea Party thing. Like you said, the Tea Party thing didn't work out so well, really, in the end. We elected the largest swing class in the history of Congress since 1938. They went to Washington, D.C. I believed everything would change. And then, nothing changed. I'd invested my life, my personal money, literally. My wife and I went to the edge of bankruptcy building the Tea Party movement. And then nothing changed. And I really believed everything was going to change. I was sure everything was going to change, and nothing changed. And so that's bad, because that's a failure. And for me, it was worse because I had a lot of people, millions of people depending on me, and saying to me, well, now what do we do? So it's okay if you're sitting around the dinner table and you're engaged in politics and your family says, well, gosh, what do we do now? And you can go, I don't know, right? When you're up here, you can't say, I don't know. It's not okay. Not if you want to stay up here, not if you really believe that you're in the fight for a purpose. And I was really struggling, and it would keep me up at night because I didn't know what to do. Because I'd tried my 8th grade civics version of politics, which is we support, we vote for, we elect the people we believe in, and then they do the things they tell us they're going to do, right? That's the 8th grade civics version. And it had not worked. And that was as sophisticated as my knowledge was. Well, I was really blessed because I came across a guy by the name of Mike Farris. If anybody in here homeschooled or has homeschooled kids? Okay, you guys know who Mike Farris is, right? Okay. Mike Farris is a hero to the homeschool movement. Back in 1970s, early 70s, homeschooling was illegal in all 50 states. Anybody not know that? I didn't know that. Seems really weird, doesn't it? Like the government won't let you teach your own kids, but that was the law. They didn't necessarily do it by saying homeschooling is illegal. They would say, oh, if you're going to teach your daughter, you have to be certified in every subject matter area. No human can do that, right? Or they would say, oh, your school facility, your home, it has to be exactly the same as a school, right? It has to have all the same things we require schools. So you just couldn't do it. Mike was a young constitutional attorney, and he said, that's wrong, which we would all agree with. And he said, I'm going to fix it, which most people would say, you're insane. No internet, no cell phones. Fax machines were high tech back then, right? And Mike built a national movement founded Homeschool Legal Defense Association, which is the largest homeschool association of this day. Ultimately built Patrick Henry College, which is a great college for homeschool kids. A lot of homeschool kids go there. And he changed America for the better. I would argue, by the way, today, from traveling around the country, from my own experience, homeschoolers will save the country. Seriously. If you don't know homeschool families, you should. They're going to save the country. Okay, so Mike comes to me one day and he says, are you happy with what you've done in politics? I say, no, I'm miserable. It's been a failure. And he says, well, that's because you're approaching the wrong problem. You think we have a personnel problem in Washington, D.C., but we don't. We have a structure problem. We have broken the structure of governance, and you can put as many good people in Washington, D.C. as you want, and we will still get bad results. And that blew my mind. I just thought you elect good people. And he explained to me why. He explained how the Constitution has expanded its definition of what the federal government can do. Federal government has huge powers it was never intended to have. If you put human beings in a place where they have access to power, they are going to use that power, right? We're human beings. That's what we do. And he said, so until we fix the structure, we're going to have the same problems. How do we fix the structure? The founders told us how to fix the structure. Here's what the founders told us about how to fix the structure. On September 15th, 1787, by the way, I think September 15th is the most important day in American history. Anybody know why? It's my wife's birthday. I didn't think you guys would get it. It is also what we call Article 5 Day. I'm glad she's not here. You're going to be in big trouble. She knows you. So September 15th, 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, it's 2 days before the end of convention, Colonel George Mason stands up. He's from Virginia. He's actually the most important man at the convention. He says more than anybody else at convention. He introduces the Virginia plan, and 2 days before the end of convention, he is once again a thorn in the side of all the other commissioners. They're done. They've drafted the entire document. They agree on it. They're ready to go home, and he says, we have a big problem. We've given the federal government the power to propose amendments, but we haven't given that same power to the people acting through their states. And then he asks a question which is still relevant today. Are we so naive that we believe that a federal government that becomes a tyranny will propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? Some people chuckled. I'm pretty sure they laughed at convention. And when I say I'm sure they laughed, I'm actually sure, and here's why I'm sure. If you read Madison's notes, if what they say in that spot is something so unusual. These guys debated everything. They debated the style of debate, right? Who gets to go first? Who goes? They debated everything on this point. Madison's notes say nin com, Latin for no comment, no debate, no discussion. Mason makes this extraordinary comment that they have this huge flaw in the document, and not one man in that room of people who love to argue, love to hear their own voices, not one of them says, oh, come on, George, give it a rest, right? They all agree. It's the collective forehead slap. And unanimously, they agree to give you and me the power to call a convention to propose amendments to restrain federal tyranny. The only thing in the Constitution that is added without debate and unanimously voted into the Constitution. It's extraordinary. And they were looking forward to the future, and they were looking at us 243 years into the future after ratification of the Constitution. They were looking to us and saying, you guys are going to have some problems. Why did they know we were going to have problems? Their crystal ball wasn't great. It was their ability to look back in history that was so strong. These men understood history. They had all read the Bible, Old and New Testament. They had read ancient Roman and ancient Greek history. They knew about all the republics. They knew all the terrible ills that had befallen all the political systems that came before them, and they knew human nature. Human nature never changes. The library gets fancier, we get computers and smartphones. Human nature never changes. And they knew people would lust after power, because that's what people do. And they knew that if we centralized a government, which is what they were creating, that would continue to centralize. Power always accretes power to itself. It is the nature of power in the hands of human beings. And so they knew they had to give us this mechanism, this radical mechanism whereby we could take the power away from Congress. I want to explain a little bit to you. Some people in the audience are new to this. I want to explain exactly how this works functionally. It's kind of an interesting process. And one of the things that I love so much as I read the history of the founders is they were experts on process. They understood the nature of structure and process, and that when you plug humans in, you're going to get a certain result based on structure and process. And so they built a structure and a process into the Constitution. The Constitution is pretty much all structure and process, and it's no different for Article 5. The first clause of Article 5 of the Constitution tells us how Congress can propose amendments to the Constitution. Whenever 2/3 of houses shall propose, right? So 2/3 of both houses propose an amendment to the Constitution, that amendment will go out to the states for ratification by 3/4 of the states. The second way is our way. It's Mason's way. And it says, whenever 2/3 of the states shall call for a convention, then Congress shall name the time and place of that convention. The states gather, debate and discuss amendments, and then if more than half of them agree to put those amendments as suggestions out to the states, they go out to the states for ratification by the same process. 3/4 of the states have to ratify any amendments that come out of a convention. So that's how the process works. Now where are we at, and what are we actually doing? Well, today, I think the federal government's out of control. Anybody agree with that? Raise your hand if you think the federal government, well, it's almost unanimous in here. Federal government is out of control, and we all think so. By the way, 72% of Americans today say that the federal government is too big and does too much. I don't know if you've looked at party registration. That's not just Republicans, right? Pretty much everybody thinks the federal government is too big and does too much. We might think different things, too much money on defense, too much money on welfare, whatever you think, but we all agree the federal government's doing too much. There's another statistic just came out recently that really terrified me. 27% of Americans believe that the federal government has the consent of the governed. That's called pre-revolutionary, my friends, right? When 3/4 of roughly of the American public says those folks in Washington, D.C. don't have my consent anymore, and our government, this republic, is a republic of consent of the governed, we have a serious problem. We are in pre-revolutionary times. When I say that, sometimes people think I'm being too radical. Like that just sounds crazy, like we're going to have a revolution. I think we're on the verge of a civil war. I would argue right now we're probably in what I would describe as a cold civil war. And I think we're fairly close to a full-blown revolution, at least a political revolution. I love to read the period before the American Revolution. Most of us, when we study the American Revolution, now you got to forgive me if I get this wrong because I went to school in Los Angeles, California. The earth was birthed from a poppy. No, I don't. I didn't actually learn that. So when we study the history of the American Revolution, most of us start somewhere around 1774, 1776, right? The revolution begins. I'm really interested in the period before the American Revolution because I want to know, like, how did they get there? It's pretty radical. You think about what they did. I mean, we're in that part of the country now, and think about what our forefathers, what those families did. They rose up against the most powerful empire ever on the face of the earth. The most powerful army, the most powerful economy, the most powerful navy. It's incredible, the pinnacle of science and philosophy and literature. They rose up against that. Something was going on. They probably really hated the British system of governance, right? I mean, you have to have they didn't. This is weird. They loved the British system of governance. Okay, I'm probably, you guys are all thinking, this guy's out of his mind. They hate, right? The tyranny, the British tyranny. They hated the king. They hated the monarchy. They loved the British system of governance. If you want to read about this, read Bernard Bailyn. He's a great historian on this, Bailyn. And Bailyn only quotes from the original writers of the era. He doesn't write through the lens of history. He goes back, pulls the original writings, and this is what you find in Bailyn's writings. The pamphleteers, which is how most people got their information, were writing both in England and here in the colonies. And you'll find this line running throughout the pamphlets when people are writing about the politics of England and the colonies. That the British government is the finest government ever invented by mankind for the preservation of liberty. Does that sound like people who want a revolution? They sound pretty happy with their government, right? Here's the thing that usually follows it, though. However, all three branches of our governments now conspire together against the people. Does that sound familiar? I don't know about you, that gives me chills. We think we have a fantastic system of governance, probably the finest ever designed by mankind for the preservation of liberty. However, today, all three branches of government, right? The legislature, the executive, and the courts conspire against us together to increase their own power, to increase their own wealth, to increase their own prestige against the interests of the people. I tell you that because when I say we're in pre-revolutionary times, I want you to understand, we are saying the same things that they were saying before they fought the American Revolution. Most people don't know about that part of our history. They loved Britain. They loved being part of Britain. They loved the British system of governance and philosophy, and they actually loved the monarchy, and they had a divided system of government. They believed in branches of government balancing each other out. They just thought their government had become corrupt and was no longer serving them. They were then where we are today. So what's the difference between us and them? They picked up their muskets and they fought the government, right? So what's the difference? Why don't we pick up our muskets or our weapons and fight the government? And the answer is because they did. Because they did for us. And so we don't have to. They shed blood, families died, businesses destroyed, so that we didn't have to do that. They gave us a gift, and that gift is our heritage, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. And they gave us those things, and inside the Constitution, hidden away in this corner of Article 5 that we've never used before, is the power to reshape our system of governance. It's an incredible power we have. We've never used it. They don't want us to use it. And we've never used it. We've come close a couple of times. People have scared us away, but we've never used it. I have a really vivid imagination. I like to think about the founders a lot. I read a lot about the founders. Probably, I think if I could talk to one of the founders, it's hard to think about, like if I had to choose one. I'm a big fan of Patrick Henry. He was an incredible orator. And Henry and Madison, they didn't like each other very much. You guys know the story about the fight between these guys? Madison is the greatest writer of the founders, right? Just an incredible writer, researcher, reads everything. Not a very good public speaker. Brings notes with him. He's kind of quiet. He's not inspiring to people. Henry never wrote a word down. Right? He was considered the greatest orator of the American Revolution. He would get up on stage and give a speech, no notes, no planning, no nothing, right? You know the most famous Patrick Henry speech? Give me liberty or give me death, right? Great speech in the Virginia House of Burgess. Amazing speech. He's 27-year-old barrister. He's just getting started. He has no right to be saying what he's saying. He's saying it to all the old gray hair guys. He's challenging Washington in that speech, who's sitting in that Virginia House of Burgess. They sent men to write down that speech because he never took notes for his speech. And when it was all over, those who were sent to write down his speech had forgotten to take notes because he was such a good speaker. We don't even know if the speech that we know is actually the speech. It had to be reconstructed afterwards. So he and Madison didn't like each other very much. I'd love to meet Madison. I recently saw Madison's book list of the books that Jefferson sent him from France. So I'd love to dig in and sit with Madison and talk about world history and philosophy and religion. I'd love to know what Henry felt before he got on stage. But the guy that I like the most, I think, in American history is probably Ben Franklin. Franklin knew everything. Like, he's so many subjects. He was so smart. And he was such a social guy. Like, everybody loved Ben. He could go out and he could be the center of attention in any room. And he was also kind of a cranky old man by the time of the Revolution. And I imagine myself talking to Ben Franklin. I imagine sitting around maybe having a pint of ale with him in one of the ale houses and say, Dr. Franklin, you know, we're so frustrated. We live in a time, it's just unbelievable, where they literally tell us what kind of light bulbs can be in our light fixtures. And we know that's not invented yet, Dr. Franklin, but we're going to get around to using that electricity thing you just discovered. And they tell us how much water our toilets can flush, right? Everything. They tell us what kind of materials can be in the paint and the walls and the carpet you wake up in the morning, the blankets you sleep in, the way your bed's made, what the traffic, everything is the government. And we're just frustrated. And I imagine he would say, well, it sounds like the federal government's out of control. And I would say, yeah, they are. Well, what have you done about it? Well, we elected a bunch more people. Okay, and how'd they do? Not very well. Okay, so what'd you do next? We complained a lot. You're like, and? And I imagine he would eventually get around to say, well, what about Article 5? Colonel Mason, he was so smart, he gave you Article 5. Have you done something with Article 5? And I would say, I mean, people have been kind of scared about that one, Ben. And I imagine he would be pretty annoyed with me. And I imagine he would say, go away. Come back, boy, when you've had some time to work this one out for yourselves. We gave you the tools, and the question is, will you have the intestinal fortitude to use them? That's really where we're at today in America, in my opinion. The real question is, will we, the people, have the intestinal fortitude? You know the famous story about Ben Franklin after he comes out of convention? Right? And he is approached by a woman who asks him, what kind of government have you given us, doctor? And he says, a republic, if you can keep it. The key word in that, by the way, is you. He didn't say, if all these guys you elect. He didn't say really wise people in Philadelphia. Washington, D.C. didn't exist yet. He didn't say a ruling elite somewhere. He said, and he was talking to just a common woman. He said, if you can keep it. To me, that's the question of our times. Can we keep it? This is really unique, what we have. We take this for granted. You know, if you look at the arc of history, of all of human history, I love to read history, and you can go all the way back in all of recorded history. The pendulum swings back and forth in history, right? You've got, on the one end is tyranny, right? And on the other end is really bad tyranny. That's the arc of human history. It really is. When you look at human history, not a lot of liberty in human history. Not a lot of human freedom. God grants us free will. We don't get much place to exercise free will really like we have it here in all of human history. The only place I know in all of human history, other than right here and now, in this time that we're living, where we have this kind of freedom, is in the Old Testament in the period of Judges. Right? You go back to the Old Testament, and the people chose from among themselves judges. There were no rulers, right? And what did the people go and do at that point? They rejected that. They said, give us a king who will tell us what to do. And we laugh about that, but I think that's right where we are in American history right now. You know, I have what I call a political theology. Now, I know you're not supposed to combine politics and religion, right? This is a really bad thing. But I do. Here's why. First, I'm going to explain why, and I'm going to explain what it is. So my political theology is, I look back to history. If you look at the definition in Greek, the ancient word for politics, the definition, I'm paraphrasing, my Greek's not that good, but basically, politics is how we organize in groups of people to influence other people. Okay, how we organize in groups of people to influence other people. That's politics. If you go back to the ancient root word for religion in ancient Greek, and you look at what that means, it's how we organize around a set of moral principles. How we organize to influence other people, how we organize around a set of moral principles. Now, I want you to think about this. If we do politics without faith, without religion, without a belief in God, that means we are trying to influence other people without any respect to any form of morality. I would posit that that's evil. And I know that's a big word. I'm not supposed to use that word either. That's just what I believe. I think if you don't have a moral code upon which you rely and you're trying to influence other people, what are you trying to influence them for? For your own benefit? For the benefit of a particular group? To make money? What is it? No, it should be tied to a moral code. For me, that's my faith. That's my Christianity. But without that, I just think we're lost. And when I look at, for me, biblically, when I look at the Bible, I say, well, look, I look at 1 Samuel 8 is really important to me. 1 Samuel 8 is what I was just talking about, right? Samuel goes to the Lord, says, Lord, I failed you, the people want a king. Right? And the Lord says, you haven't failed me, it's not you, it's them. Like, they're the ones who want a king, you're doing it right. He says, go tell them that they're going to get whatever they want. They're going to get a king. King's going to take their sons and make them into his soldiers. King's going to take their crops, the best of their crops and their livestock, and make them his. Going to take their daughters into his house. They'll be his perfumers, right? Basically, the government's going to control them. You've heard the saying, a government big enough to give you what you want is big enough to take it all away too, right? So that's what he's saying there. And God gives us what we want. That's the worst punishment he can ever dole out on us, what we want, right? And that's what happens there. It doesn't go very well for them. And the other end of my personal political theology would be Romans 13. And in Romans 13, we're told that we're supposed to obey the governing authorities. All authorities anointed by God, right? I believe that. And I did not like that when I first read that. I was really annoyed by that. I'm a rebel. Like, I don't like the government. I don't want to have to listen to the governing authority. By the way, I had a blue mohawk in law school, if you don't believe I'm a rebel. Right? There are no photos, so you have to believe me. There was no digital back then, thank God. But if you look at that and you say, we're supposed to obey the governing authorities, what does that mean? So we just go, okay, well, Washington, D.C. is bad, and the president's bad, or these courts are bad. And I really had to dig into this, and I spent a lot of time talking to people who know a lot more than me about everything, politics, theology, scripture, and I came to an entirely different understanding of Romans 13. The government's different in every time period in history. Who the governing authorities are different. In the days of the ancient Romans and in Christ's time, it was Caesar. Right? So Caesar was the guy. All law came from Caesar. Everything came from Caesar. And so that was the governing authority, and that was the point at the time. In this country, in this day and age, who is the governing authority? Anybody? The people. Father, you got it right. We the people. This is really weird in all of human history. Our Constitution says something entirely unique. It says, we the people. If you look at the governing documents of every other country in history, including all those that exist today, they are essentially a grant of rights by a government to a people. That's the way governing documents work. Our Constitution is a weapon to be wielded by the people against the government to prevent them from infringing upon our God-created rights. It's exactly the opposite, right? So who are the governing authorities? We are. So that means something. It means something pretty radical in my opinion. So when I first realized that, I was pretty self-righteous about it because I thought, okay, I get it. I'm right. Those guys in DC are all wrong. They're going to be punished. And my friend Tim, who's a lot wiser than me, said, no, you don't get that right at all. What? Like they're not listening to us. And he goes, yeah, and you're the governing authority. And you're not doing anything about that, are you? And you have the power to do something about that, don't you? I said, yeah. And he goes, so who is really responsible? Right? So with great authority comes great responsibility. And we have been given the authority in this country. We are the sovereign in the United States of America. We are the rulers in this country. We are in charge in this country. And by the way, we don't need to change anything to be in charge. We have this power right now, today. It's been given to us. Not given to us by the government, by the way, given to us by God, endowed by our Creator. Our Constitution, our government designed to protect that. And when they get out of control, it's up to us to hold them accountable. Or we will suffer the punishment and we will be held accountable here and in the after, in my opinion. So the question is, do we have the fortitude? Will we do it? My opinion is we will. In fact, we are. This organization 6 years ago was me and my wife and about 5 other people. Today, As of yesterday, I heard we've just passed 4.1 million people. All right, that's serious. I could never have imagined that, right? In 6 years, I couldn't have imagined that. And so here we are, we've now passed our resolution in 15 states. The resolution that calls for this convention is passed in 15 states. We have to get to 34, that means 19 to go. I'm going to real quick close with what the resolution says, and then I'm going to open it for questions because that's really the most important part. So the way the resolution works is it takes both houses in a state to pass the resolution to put that on the books as a state calling for a convention. The resolution has three things in it. It's what's called a subject matter resolution, and the three things are this. At convention, we're going to talk about anything that could impose fiscal restraint on the federal government. Does that sound good to you guys? Get their fiscal house in order? So things like a balanced budget amendment, tax and spending caps. How about limiting taxes based on growth in GDP or growth in population plus inflation? Here's a radical and unique one. How about making the federal government use generally accepted accounting principles instead of Skittles and M&Ms? Right? The second is anything that would impose term limits on federal officials. That might include Congress. Anybody think some of these guys stay around too long? Yeah. So term limits on Congress, but how about term limits on bureaucrats, staffers, and the judges on the courts, right? So that's term limits. And then to me, the most important one, anything that would impose limitations on the scope, the power, and the jurisdiction of the federal government. Anybody think the federal government has too much power? Yeah, way too much. So let me give you a perfect example of that, and I'll close and we'll go to questions. So there's a little clause in the Constitution called the Commerce Clause. You guys, most of you have heard of the Commerce Clause? Okay, so the Commerce Clause was intended to be a narrow grant of power to the federal government. It says this, that the federal government has the power to regulate interstate commerce, right? And so when we read that, regulation to us means regulate, right? Regulations that control something. And we think of maybe the Federal Register, which is now 80,000 pages or some ridiculous amount of pages or something, or you know that the state of Connecticut has incredible amount of regulation over everything you put. We think of regulation, right? In 1787, they had no such thing. If you had said the Federal Register, they would not know what that is. If you said the government regulates industry, they would not know what you meant. When they said regulate, what they meant was regularize. Make it smooth, make it work, right? And there's a reason. Your neighbors, New York and New Jersey, are in a trade war at the time of the 1787 convention, and they're about to come to military blows over tariffs. And so these guys in that room were saying, hey, we got to stop that. That's crazy. We got to get along. We'll give the federal government the power to smooth that stuff out. Interstate means the same thing between states. Commerce in 1787. When we say commerce, we mean business, right? Doing commerce is doing business. A store engages in commerce. When you go buy something at a store, you engage in commerce. You buy something online, you engage in commerce. In 1787, commerce means the shipment of goods. It doesn't mean business. So what do they give the federal government the power to do? Smooth out the shipment of goods across state lines. Because that's the fight we're having right then, right? It's a narrow, narrow power. In 1931, there's a case called Wickard v. Filburn. This most insane case ever by the Supreme Court. Farmer is growing wheat for the consumption of his own household, his livestock, his family in Ohio. The government has quotas on how much wheat you can grow. He grows too much wheat. They impose penalties on him. He says, I'm growing wheat for my own family. You have no legal right to impose penalties on me. And they said, oh yes, but we do, the Interstate Commerce Clause. And he says, I'm not engaged in commerce. I didn't sell anything. I didn't buy anything. I didn't ship anything across state lines. And they said, exactly. Yeah? They said, because you did not buy anything off the interstate markets, you have now affected interstate commerce. Which means doing nothing equals doing something, which means the government can regulate anything. There's a long line of cases that follow on from there. By the way, the Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, EPA, USDA, FDA, Education, Energy, all these departments operate under Commerce Clause authority. In other words, our beloved Constitution has nothing in it that says that the federal government can do any of those things. It's all invented by the courts. So when I say limit the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government, how about we take the Commerce Clause and go like this? Woo-hoo. Anybody in favor of that? Yeah. Okay, so I've talked a lot, probably more than I should have. I always do. I'm a lawyer, so you gotta forgive. So what I'd love to do at this point is thank you guys for your patience and open it up for questions, which is always the best part of the evening. So don't be shy, go for it. We got a Marine right here down front. Hoorah.
To see people in Congress that we know are working against our Constitution. Is there something that we can do to remove these people immediately? They prove themselves. We have evidence of who they are and what they're doing. Yet they sit in office and it frustrates them that we can't seem to get a hold of them and say, you're out. We don't want you.
Can you hear or need me to repeat? Okay, I'll repeat. So the question is, it's frustrating because we see people in Congress, they don't really live up to their oath of office, they don't follow the Constitution, they're still there and we can't seem to dislodge them from Congress. Is there anything we can do? So I'm going to give you an answer that you're probably not going to like. And it's not what you expect though. It's not just that we can't. We can, sort of. The answer is mostly they're following the Constitution, even when we think they're not. And here's why I say it. Sometimes I travel with a prop. My Big Blue was too full this trip to bring my prop, but you can order from the government printing office the Constitution of the United States of America. Anybody carry a pocket Constitution with them? Yeah, here's one right here. Look, can you hold that up for me? Now, if you order the Constitution of the United States of America from the government printing office, it doesn't look anything like that. When it comes to your house, well, first of all, you're going to be surprised because the charge on your MasterCard or American Express is going to be $130. And when it gets to your house, it's going to be in a big cardboard box. It's going to weigh over 10 pounds. It's going to be 2,738 pages. If you order the supplements, it'll be over 3,000 pages. And it says on the spine, I'm not making it up, it says Constitution of the United States of America. And what it contains is every single case, including the one I just told you about, ever issued by the United States Supreme Court interpreting that beautiful document. And they live according to this Constitution. So almost everything they do, if you were to say, well, that's unconstitutional, somebody could turn to page 1857 and say, hey, the Supreme Court has said right here what I'm doing is fine. And so our problem isn't the original Constitution, and it's not even that they're not following it, it's that the courts have bloated the Constitution to this behemoth. We call it Conan for Constitution Annotated, which is this behemoth book that no one person has ever read, nobody understands, and it's just a perversion of what our original Constitution was intended to be. So the way we fix it is by Article 5, we can take this and turn it into something closer to this. That's the intent of what we're doing. Who else? Yes, sir.
Hi. So first of all, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
It's been a really wonderful, very informative. And thank you for the tea party.
You're welcome.
And,
Absolutely.
I wanted to say, I was a member of the Tea Party, and then I got scared to death by Lois Lerner and the IRS. And, I was just really afraid of my government and what they were doing to folks by, going after them.
Yep.
Because they were practicing, what they had the right to practice. And I wanted to ask you, what's going to stop them from doing that again to us?
I'm going to say something very bold. Me. And here's what I mean by that. That sounds big and brash, but here's what I mean by that. So when that started happening, it was happening to you and me and all of our friends all over the country. It happened to my good friend Ginny Rapini, who serves with me right now, and she was the head of my local Tea Party organization. Grandma of like 6 grandkids, just a wonderful lady, and the IRS came down on her and her husband. She was audited federally as well as at the state level. She received these crazy questionnaires where they're asking for the content of our prayers at our meetings, our reading lists, our donor list. I mean, it was just completely unconstitutional. It was like weird Soviet-style tactics, right? The weirdest thing happened. So she called me when she first got this request for all this stuff, and she was crying, and she said, I can't do this. There's no, I just can't comply with this. There's no way. And I understood, and I said, I understand, I'll support you, whatever you want to do. And she called me back the next day and she said, you know what, that's what they're trying to make me do. They want me to quit. I'm going to do it. I'm not going to quit. That production, by the way, required in the box that we sent them, 2 bankers' boxes full of documents, was a Beanie Baby teddy bear. That was red, white, and blue because they required we send them everything we'd ever given away at a Tea Party meeting. And one meeting on a 4th of July, we gave away teddy bears. So, but here's what I did about it. So I was frustrated by this, and I was listening to all these TV lawyers, no offense intended to them, but Jay Sekulow, Cleta Mitchell, and they were on television talking about the damn IRS doing all this bad stuff. And I got on the phone with those guys and I said, well, what are you guys gonna do about it? And they're, well, we don't know, and we're analyzing, and we're thinking, and I finally just said, okay, forget it, I'll do it. And so we found lawyers out of Kansas City. I hired a former US attorney. I raised $4.5 million to sue the IRS. And last December, they settled for $3.5 million with us. So it cost us way more because all that money went out to the Tea Party groups. But we beat the IRS. Now this is, like, I am unaware of anybody else ever getting money out of the IRS. Right? It doesn't normally work that way. And so what I will tell you is that I will personally stand against it. And one last thing I want to say about that. I'm going to get Lois Lerner. I'm not done with Lois Lerner. Lois Lerner, yeah. If you're watching, Lois, I'm going to get you. I'm serious about this. Lois Lerner testified in that case. And I think it was 7 hours of deposition testimony. Her lawyers demanded that her deposition be held under seal. The plaintiffs were not allowed to attend her deposition. And her reasoning was, if people hear what I say, they'll be so mad that people will threaten my life. I want you to think about that standard. For our federal government officials, the standard would be, I have to do something so bad that people will want to kill me. That way I can get away with it. I mean, that's the standard that she's professing. Here's the amazing thing. The whole case is settled. It's all done. It's not entirely dismissed. There's one issue still on the record, which is we still don't have her deposition. Everything else is dismissed. The whole case has been peeled away. There's this one little issue sitting there, and I can't get that dang judge to rule. He just will not rule. That's been sitting there for close to a year now, that issue. I will chase Lois Lerner until I can go complain to her manager at McDonald's that she makes a lousy hamburger. That's my attitude about Lois Lerner. So I think, and in all seriousness, the answer to your question is the only way we prevent it is by standing up against it. And I'm willing to stand up against it, and I can do it if other people will stand with me. If you have to fight alone, it's impossible. It's too terrifying. But if we all stand together, and one more thing is, I intend to do away with the IRS in my lifetime. We should have no agency in the federal government that we fear. Yes, ma'am.
So we believe that the founding fathers put this all together with our best interests at heart. And I guess my question is, in knowing human nature, if you succeed and you get 2/3 of the state, how do you keep this movement from becoming perverted?
I think that's a great question. And I actually think, so that's a question that I get asked more than anything else. And I'm going to, I'm sorry, the question is, how do we keep it, we get 2/3 of states, we get into convention, how do we keep the movement from running off the rails or getting perverted? And there's a term for this that people use called the Runaway Convention. How do you prevent the convention from running away? Maybe they'll do away with the First Amendment and freedom of religion or the Second Amendment, right? And so how do you prevent that? I'm going to go back to where I started early on. It's about structure. And so there is a structure in place that has to be followed that's in the Constitution that the founders gave us. Opponents of this, good-hearted opponents, will say, well, we have no idea how these things work. There's no way to know, right? And the real answer to that is the courts have said that these things run, it's been litigated in the courts about 40 times. Courts have said it's according to history and tradition. We've had roughly 40 interstate conventions in American history. There were 11 before the 1787 Constitutional Convention. There have been about 30, roughly 30 since. All run exactly the same. Virtually the same set of rules, the same procedures, the same way they elect officers. And in all of those, in all of American history, from the beginning to the modern era, there's never been a convention that ran off the rails. Never. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is this. The convention is set up in a way that it really can't run off the rails. Every state passes the same resolution. So you have 34 states that all say, we want to get together, and this is the reason we want to get together. So some people will say, yeah, but you're from California, and those crazy people from California, they're going to try and do something else. Yes, but 34 states 2/3 of states agreed in advance that we were only going to do these 3 things. California is not going to be able, on its own, to drive off 2/3 of the states. So that's just the first layer of protection, right? The second is it runs exactly like a legislature. We held a simulated convention. You could watch this online. And we ran one. We brought in state legislators from all over the country, 3 from each state, and they ran one of these. And what happens is, who is your state legislature going to choose? Well, California is going to choose a bunch of lunatics. I know that. They'll be leftist lunatics. Texas will choose a bunch of conservatives. Different states will choose different people, but they're going to choose people that they inherently trust. They're not selecting people at random on the internet, right? And so they're going to select people that are going to go according to the instructions they're given. They're actually given written instructions. And so I have people say this to me all the time. Well, you don't understand. The delegates are going to get there and they're going to do whatever they want to do. And the answer is that's just not human nature. Like, I'm a student of human nature. I know people do crazy stuff. But when a legislature chooses somebody they respect, it's a colleague, it's a peer, it's a former governor. That person is not going to convention and just going to go, you know what, all those guys sent me, they're all watching me minute by minute on YouTube or on C-SPAN. I'm just going to do something completely different. Let's say I'm wrong. Now they're in convention. They go crazy. I don't know, maybe the Californians bring a bunch of good weed and they all go crazy, right? It's possible. I'm from California. I know these things. And they get in there and they just start doing crazy stuff, right? And let's say the delegates from Texas, they're talking about repealing the Second Amendment. The Texas legislature is going to be watching every minute. And those are their representatives, their agents, by common law agency and by all known law, they have the right to stop those agents, to withdraw them, to remove their authority. The second they see anybody doing anything they don't want, they're going to say, all right, our guy's out, our alternate's in. Right? So they have absolute control over the delegation the entire time they're there. Now let's say I'm completely wrong about that. Maybe every legislature in America and every conservative state, they all go to sleep and none of them even watch the convention. So they lose complete control. They're all smoking California weed. They've lost control. They talk about repealing the Second Amendment. You have to get 26 states to agree to that to get it out of convention. Today, 31 state legislatures, both houses controlled by Republicans. A couple more are split legislatures, right? Those states are not going to vote to pull something out of convention that's some crazy leftist thing that we wouldn't like. Maybe I'm wrong. California is it's a great place. They got a lot of beautiful people and they convince all these other people to do something crazy. And so let's say they get it out of convention, right? There's another step, which is now you have to presume that every conservative litigation organization in America stands down, right? By the way, this is a place where conservatives have the advantage. We are way better at litigation than the left. And we have a lot of incredible organizations like First Liberty and ACLJ. I mean, there's so many of them, I could go on and on. They're all going to immediately intervene in the federal courts and say, this thing ran off the rails, there was a mandate, they exceeded that mandate. That's going to get tied up in litigation. Do I trust the courts? No, I don't trust the courts. Although I have to say the Supreme Court's better today than it was a couple of years ago, you guys think? Okay, so maybe the Supreme Court. And so now let's say I'm wrong about that. All these conservative litigation firms stand down, we lose every court battle. Now it goes out to the states for ratification, right? It takes 38 states to ratify. I'm going to do the one that I hear the most often, which is we're going to lose our Second Amendment. And I'm a big Second Amendment guy. I grew up in a law enforcement family, so I'm pretty serious about that. Sitting on my legal advisory board, a guy by the name of Chuck Cooper. He was Reagan's personal constitutional attorney. He was the outside constitutional litigator for the NRA for the last 30 years, litigating the Second Amendment. He says there can't be a runaway, right? He says we can't lose the Second Amendment. So let's say we're both wrong, it goes out to the states for ratification. You got to get 38 states to ratify it. That means it takes only 13 states to not ratify, right? That's the is that right? I'm from LA. Is my math okay there? So only 13 states to stop it. And so now I just go like, okay, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, the Dakotas, Texas. By the way, Virginia is a constitutional carry state. You're not going to get gun control. So the bottom line is, it's literally impossible to get to 38 states on something you and I wouldn't like. And that's the fail-safe in the very end that was created by the founders.
See, I'm being cynical. I think the process sounds like you got it.
Yep.
But what if the movement, this is being cynical, gets infiltrated?
Right.
And you have people that just like our government, they just bog it all down and it goes nowhere.
I think that's possible. I actually think
That's not
possible.
the good answer.
Well, no. Look, it's the honest answer. I think my greatest fear about this movement is that we get into convention and it can't get anything done. I think you do exactly what we're doing here, because I think that there's only one thing that will save this country. It's where I started this whole, thank you for the segue, it's where I started. It's you. It's the only thing that can save this country. It's gonna take, we have 4.1 million, I'm really proud of that. It's gonna take 30 million of us, right? When we're 30 million, I promise you, we'll be unstoppable. 30 million influencers, opinion leaders, the politicians will be scared of us. And I want to add one more part about this, because I'm saying things that sound very partisan. And I'm a right winger, that's where I come from. But I want you to understand that this movement and what we're trying to accomplish has nothing to do with partisanship. Because if you heard everything I said, there's no policy in there, right? I'm not saying cut welfare. I'm not saying anything. We're not talking about gender or marriage or any of that stuff. What we're talking about is who decides. If you come away from this with only one thing from this meeting, if somebody says, what was that thing about that you went to? What is this Convention of States thing? This is what I want you to say. I want you to say, do you think people in Washington, D.C. should decide for us, or do you think people in Connecticut should decide for us? And if they say people in Connecticut, then you should say, you're going to like this Convention of States thing, because that's all it's about. And so I think when we really get to it, and there are tens of millions of people, people are going to get that. Most people don't like the federal government. You know, if you have friends who are from really way on the left, I have friends way on the left. This is what I say to them about it. So, are you enjoying President Trump? If they don't hit me, their face turns red, right? And then I say, you like Mitch McConnell and all the judges being confirmed out of the Senate? Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, you enjoying that? And if they don't hit me and the blood isn't getting all over me that's spurting out of their ears at that point, I say, do you like those people telling you what to do? And they say, hell no, I don't. And I say, me either. Me either. I don't want the president or the courts or Congress telling us what to do in Connecticut. I don't care whether it's Trump and McConnell or Obama and Pelosi. We're all in this together. It's us versus them. It's not us versus us. And so that's my pitch. But I'm going to be perfectly honest, that my biggest fear is we get there and it's hard to get anything done. That's the thing that scares me the most. And it's going to take us to prevent that. Yes, ma'am, right here.
What I wonder about is, how do you get a state like Connecticut that's been ruled by Democrats for 40 years, and they are so far left, and yet people keep voting them in office? How do you convince a state legislature that's under the control of CU? How do you ever get them on board with something like this?
So it's really, I'm going to go back to the same thing that I started with, which is us. And they do listen to us, to their constituents. So our job is to build a big enough grassroots army. What's really interesting is in the legislature, what you will find is very few citizens, right? So they have a hearing on any given issue, and very few people will show up. And they're lucky, they'll get a lobbyist. There might be a citizen who's fanatical on a particular issue, one or two who show up. If it's a real hot button, occasionally they'll get some people, but almost every hearing has no people in it observing the hearing. I was in Pennsylvania yesterday, and in Pennsylvania, in a hearing room, we had standing room only. We probably had 150 citizens in there, all wearing Convention of States buttons. Those legislators, Democrat and Republican, were listening, because they look at it in that audience, that's a lot of voters, and those people represent even more voters. But I want to add one more thing that's really important. Like, I come from California. Honestly, California makes Connecticut look like a red state. It's so bad, and you can't even imagine. Look, we just imposed statewide rent control yesterday, by the way. The voters voted it down by 20 points a couple of months ago, and the governor and the legislature. So that's how bad it is in California. Our people in California have one of the biggest grassroots armies of anywhere in the United States in Convention of States. And here's the reason why. Why are you guys here tonight? Because it's so bad here in Connecticut. Because there's nothing to hope for here in Connecticut. Because you look at the legislature, you're like, really? So like, what are we going to do in that legislature, right? But here you have a chance to participate in something at a local level that has a national effect. And I think we can get it done here in Connecticut. But I'm going to tell you, even if we don't, it's really important that you build the Army. Because whether or not you pass the resolution here in Connecticut, Connecticut's coming to convention. And somebody is going to influence your legislature when they go to convention. And you know, legislatures are a weird place. They're always looking for experts. This is a big deal in a legislature. If you go into a legislature and you say, hey, I want to talk about light bulbs, they're going to be like, hey, Representative Giffords is the light bulb expert in our legislature. Or they're going to know there's an activist that's just all about light bulbs. So what you want to be is the Army that's all about Article 5. And so what's going to happen is when it's time for convention, Democrat or Republican, those legislators are going to come to you guys and they're going to say, they're these crazy COS people. They've been talking about this thing for 8 years. They know what's going on. We need to bring them in and figure out what's going on. Because Connecticut does not want to go to that convention and be voiceless or powerless. And they're going to look to you guys, whether you're of their party or not, because your state is going to represent your state's interests in that convention. And by that time, they're going to understand it's only about things that are about the power balance between DC and Connecticut. The legislature in Connecticut, their budget is controlled roughly 60% by Washington, D.C. Most citizens don't know this. This is amazing. When you cast your vote for your Connecticut legislator, if they get elected, they're going to exercise approximately 40 to 35% of your vote, because the rest is decided by some nameless, faceless bureaucrat in D.C. And all we're saying is we want your legislature to have more power and more money to decide what to do. It'd be better for the citizens of Connecticut, even if it's run by a party that you don't agree with. Well, at least we have a chance to affect policy here in Connecticut. We got no chance to affect policy in Washington, D.C. Yes, sir.
Process question.
Yeah.
If we get the convention going and we agree on 3 amendments and they go out for a vote, let's say we miss by a couple of states, do we then start back at square one, or what's the process of that?
Did you guys hear that? What's the process? If we go out and we put amendments out for ratification and we don't get them ratified, do we start over again? So one clarification and then an answer. It doesn't have to be 3 amendments, it could be 30 amendments, right? Yeah, so it's 3 subject matter areas. You could have 5 in each, you could have none in one. So there'll be a slate. The Bill of Rights was a slate of 12 proposed amendments that went out together. No, they're not voted by slate. So they come out one by one, but if they all come out at once, which is what I anticipate, they'll go out to the states all together, and then they're voted on individually in the states. Likely, the convention itself will set a time frame for ratification. We don't know what that time frame will be. The reason I believe they'll set a time frame is because we have a history of not setting a time frame. The 27th Amendment, by the way, was ratified just a few years ago. Yep, Greg Watson, exactly. Great man. And so this is an amendment that sat around forever and it just got ratified. And so that scares people, which it should, right? We shouldn't have an amendment sitting out there for 100+ years. There was also something called the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, that was put out there, and there was a big fight over the timeline for ratification. There was a 7-year time frame, tried to extend it. And so I think the convention will set a time frame. If I had to guess, it'll be 7 years. If you don't make it, start over again. That's how it works. Yes, sir.
Do we know what the status is in Connecticut?
One of you guys want to speak to status in Connecticut? You guys have filed, is that correct? Where are you at?
The legislature for this coming year goes, I think they start on February 5th. It will be our intention to file the resolution at that point in time. It goes through a single committee, a joint committee, government, administration, and something or other, I don't remember the third piece. And that committee gives it a yay or nay vote, which will then cause it to be moved directly to the Senate and to the House to be voted on. So obviously the crucial committee is that one that's going to give it a yay or nay vote. Last year they just put it aside. They said too much to do and they just put it aside.
And do we have a chief sponsor?
We are working on one now. We have a couple that we haven't been going, but we still have a lot of work to do in terms of sponsorship and participation. Again, we have a bunch of volunteers. We could use a lot more. We need a lot more work to get it done.
Okay, let's do one more question before we close it out. And you've been real patient back there in the corner.
No problem. Kind of two-part really. So, you know, you play probabilities, right? So do you work to a map that says we've got 15, we need this many more, this is how we prioritize our states?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the way we categorize our states as states that we think are real hot for closure in the next session, those that we consider we're working and growing, and those that I would call a planting state. Like if we don't even have a sponsor, we're planting in that state and trying to bring that up. So that's the first part.
So, yeah, so, you know, when I was in a corporate life, I was in an industry that needed to be pretty dynamic, right? So I had a very well-developed change management model.
Yep.
So first of all, cause for change, you've done a tremendous job explaining that. Vision for the future, good job explaining that. A couple of major commitments to an amendment. And then, you know, the third thing is most critical, right? The steps to get there.
Yep.
And so when I got interested in this conversationally a couple of months ago, the first time in Mailed You Money, I read everything I could, but I didn't feel like I got a good sense for how does this work.
Right.
At a high level, I could see it. At a real level, I couldn't see it. So I'm here, you know, I'll try to learn a bit more, but is there a resource that I'm missing?
What are you looking for specifically?
Just the idea of how this model works at a more detailed level. Like you talk about process and structure. I'm a total process and structure guy.
Yeah, I mean, not so, I would say, I mean, I'm happy to share it with you privately, and I say privately with as many people as who want to. That's not something that most people want. Like, that's not general consumption materials. And there are probably some things that I would be happy to tell you that I don't want out there.
Because the trick is, I'm in Connecticut.
Yeah.
I live way the hell up in the northwest corner, right? So I drove 50 miles to get
Thank
here.
you for coming.
My little town is responsible. We have a fiscal surplus every year. Last year, it blew my head off. The state wrote us a letter and said, we're taking all your money because you have a lot and we need it. Usually we give you your money back for education, but not this year. We're taking $350,000 and you're getting $25 back.
Wow.
So my first selectman writes a note. He says, we're going to have to figure it out. And this guy's super responsible. He figures it out. And then they keep coming back for more, right? And that, you know, now I'm at the point where I'm not distracted by work and raising kids anymore. And now I spend too much time reading this stuff.
Well, so let me give you a little bit of a view to process and how we look at it. And as a guy who's done business and corporate structure, you'll appreciate this. So everything that we do is strategic. Nothing is accidental. Everything is very dynamic in the political world, in the business world too, depending on what you're doing. If you're in a non-commodity world, it's got to be pretty dynamic. And so that's how we operate. I'm a business first guy. We operate a nonprofit like a business. I have a guy that I work with, and he was a PR guy and a corporate strategist and a crisis management guy. He's worked for every major electronics manufacturer in the world, every major pharmaceutical manufacturer in the world. All he does is strategy. And so anytime we want to do something, I say, hey, let's have a plan and a strategy. So that's how we work everything. I'll give you an example of this, kind of the meta strategy. I get asked this question a lot. It seems like if I look at your website, you guys are kind of partisan. Right? You got Mark Levin, you got Hannity, you got Shapiro. It's a bunch of, it's red meat right-wingers. And that is correct. And people will say, I think you're going to need some more moderate people at some point or you're not going to make it. I think that is correct as well. Here's the deal. We're running a presidential campaign. This is literally a presidential campaign. We're in all 50 states. We have grassroots, ground war. We have an air war. We do advertising. We have a digital war. We're on the internet. All of those things are moving around in connected pieces. And if you ever watch how campaigns run, if you've ever been involved in a campaign, if you watch a presidential campaign has to play to its base first. So the first piece of our strategy is build the base. If you don't play to your base, you never make it to the main game, right? So if you look at a political candidate today and they're super moderate and they play right down the middle, they will never get their party's nomination. So you look at the left is veering wildly to the left. We don't like this about politics. I'm sorry, it's just reality. It's the way it works. So our base, I would argue, is roughly 62 million people. It's people who voted for Trump. That's the easiest way to categorize our base. We slice it and dice it more than that, but that's kind of the broad sweep. We have 4.1 million people who are engaged in what we're doing today. We don't even have 10% of our base. So our goal is to get to about 40% of the base, and then our messaging will actually change. It will not change enough that will offend you guys, but it will be much more moderate. It won't be as red meat as my messaging is today. So that's part of the broader long-term strategy of how we think through things.
Yeah, it is kind of detailing, Rick, but
Oh, I'm happy to do it with
the
you.
in my life is that anything I ever accomplished was because we grounded out, not because it just happened.
No, I completely agree with that. And look, there's something that's happening to me right now, which is so miraculous, it's hard to even fathom, which is that when the Tea Party movement happened, some people will say, I get introduced sometimes as a person who founded the Tea Party movement. And I think that's kind of like saying when a guy comes out of the surf in Hawaii and he's ridden the perfect wave, and people say, man, you made such a nice wave, right? It's like, yeah, well, I'll take a little credit for surfing, but the wave God created. That was really the Tea Party movement. I would say this movement's different. I mean, we've actually had to manufacture this movement. And I would say I don't know many people that have had the privilege of riding 2 of these waves in a lifetime. It's a fluke usually, and doing it a second time seems almost impossible, and we're doing it. I know what it feels like to be engaged in movement. This is what it feels like. It's not normal. It's not normal politics. And so that's where we're at. So this is a second movement that's taking place, but this one is studied based on the first. I'll add one more thing for you, and hopefully the rest of you guys will find it fascinating. I'll come to you next, which is my theory of politics is open source, which is open source. So if any of you are computer folks, you know what I mean by open source. There was a movement that started taking place in software about, I don't know, it's probably 25 years ago now. There was a main operating system that all the big giant computers ran on. It was called Unix. And a bunch of geeky coders started writing something called Linux. And they did it for free. It was the weirdest thing. And it was complicated and difficult stuff. And they wrote it for no apparent reason other than the beauty and joy of coding. Right? These are artists and technicians, and they did it for the creative juice of it, and they did it for the recognition of their peers. And they built a system, frankly, that was better than Unix. It ultimately outpaced Unix, and it was free. And to me, it was just the most incredible thing to watch. And I was a technology lawyer at the time, and so I was just kind of watching it as an interested observer and just loving it. And there's a lot of intellectual property things around it that fascinated me. And when I started to get into the Tea Party movement, all of a sudden I saw the exact same pattern. And I said, politics is changing. It's becoming open source. It used to be consultants and politicians and media people. And all of a sudden, thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of citizens were participating on their own, and they were sharing code. This is what the Tea Party Patriots was. We were the place that the code base was held. And the very first piece of code is, let's hold a Tea Party protest. Nobody even knew what that was. That's the kernel of the code, right? We didn't even know what it was. Tea Party protest, that's what the initial code said. And we went out, and when I came home that first night, I realized I had 150 people at my first event. And we didn't have a clipboard for people to give us their information on. And so I came home and I told other people at the event, hey, if you have an event, you gotta have a clipboard with a spreadsheet on it so people can give you their email address and stuff, because I had no way to collect people's. So that became part of the code, right? And somebody else had 500 people at their event, nobody could hear anything. And so they said, man, if you have 500 people, you gotta have a sound system. That became part of the code. And I started to watch this code base build, and I would tell you by the time I left Tea Party Patriots in 2012, there are millions of lines of code. And that's how our business model works as an operation. Almost everything, I wouldn't say everything, but 90% of everything good that you see this organization do doesn't come from me, doesn't come from my paid staff, it comes from the grassroots. I go into a meeting, I'm like, what are you guys doing there? That's unbelievable. Wait, how, what, where? Will you teach us that? And that becomes, so our model is an open source model, which in my opinion is inherently effective, powerful, self-correcting, and financially sound. So that's how we operate, right here.
Hi, Mark. I'm Suzanne Rossini. I'm the district captain here, and I have a volunteer question.
Yes.
I've only been a district captain for a year. I've learned a lot in a year, and one of the things that I'm struggling with is, this is a long game. This is, my computer just went all over the floor.
No, it's closed. You're good.
Okay. This is a really long game. So I'm gathering people, because I love people too. I'm gathering people at my Patriots breakfast at my home. It doesn't have to be from my district. It can be Stamford, New Canaan, this area. It can be anybody. But to keep them engaged in a way. And I think one of the things, give me 2 things that keep people engaged for a long game.
So there's the number one thing, number one, by far, and there's not even a close second, is relationship, right? That's why people stay. And this is where I learned this is kind of weird. So I've done all kinds of businesses. I'm an entrepreneurial addict. It's just what I do. I've been building businesses my whole life. One of my favorite businesses I was ever engaged in was a network marketing business. I know. Everybody mocks those things. I did really well. We built a worldwide business. A lot of people came in, and you'll hear a lot of people fail in network marketing, right? A lot of people fail in business generally. Numbers are about the same, but keeping people in is a big deal. Like, how do you keep people in? And the answer is relationship. That's how you keep people in. You know, we've got a priest here with us. Father, how do you keep people in church?
I'd like to humbly share 2 visions, 2 stories, one from the Hebrew Testament, one from the New Testament. Nehemiah, how did he rebuild the broken wall of Jerusalem? He said, wherever the wall is broken near you, you fix it. You read that, Nehemiah. It's a wonderful book about inspiration and relationship. The other one I suggest is The Good Samaritan. Personal responsibility. He didn't look at government. He said, oh, this poor person is sick and hurt. Government, what should you do about it? No, he took him on his animal, brought him to his friend, relationship, someone who owned an inn. He had 2 silver coins. That is a model of what we're talking about. One more thing, if you don't mind. I love this whole thing with the Convention of States because since I was a little fellow, I loved God and I loved my country. And the one thing that God, check it out in the Bible, does not like is apathy. We have to wake people up, and this is a wonderful, positive way to wake people up. Thank you.
So I'll add one more thing, and this comes from the communists. Dead serious about this. There's a great book, probably the best book I've ever read on leadership, not a very well-known or popular book. It's by Douglas Hyde, Hyde. It's called Dedication and Leadership. You might know Douglas Hyde. Hyde was the head of the PR arm of the Communist Worker Daily in London, right? And he was there for many, many years. He wrote for the Daily, he distributed the Daily, and he recruited people for the Communist Party. And he left the party, he became a Catholic, and really spent the rest of his life working inside the Catholic Church. And about, 25 years later, 30 years later, he was very frustrated with the Catholic Church. And his frustration was, those communists have nothing. There's no humanity, it's evil, they're destroying people, and they're so good at recruiting people. And we have so much to offer, salvation and hope and love, and we're so bad at recruiting people. And we should learn the good stuff from the communists. And Douglas Hyde talks about what he learned from the communists about building an organization and bringing people in. One of the big things is this, and I do recommend this. We're always scared to ask people to do stuff. Like, well, if I ask them, and maybe then they will go away because they're afraid to do the work, right? And what Hyde would do, and I'm not suggesting you do this, but it's an example. When somebody came in and they said, I want to be part of the Communist Party, you'd say, fantastic, we're so glad to have you, we need you. And here's your first assignment. These are Communist Worker Daily newspapers, go out on the street corner and sell them. And these people would go out and do this. They were not very popular. And people would yell at them, and people would ask them, like, how can you say this? And communism is ruining people's lives. And the people would come back, and this is what they would say, comrade, I don't know how to answer the questions. Can you teach me? And he would say, oh, there's a class at my house on Saturday. You can come, right? And so instead of telling people, there's all this stuff you have to learn to be a good Convention of States person, right? And that's kind of overwhelming, and like, how much on the website do I need to know? No, just get people involved, let them know what they know, bring them to a gun show with you, a book fair, wherever you're going out in public. People will start to ask them questions. They're going to have a good time being with you. You're a fun person and you like people. So they're going to have a great time. You're going to build some relationship, and they'll start to thrive and need that knowledge. And that's what will bring them along. And I think with that, we ought to close. I will stick around as long as you guys want to stick around and ask personal questions. Thank you for being here. God bless you guys. Thank you.